it's not all simultaneous, fortunately. But he pushes west, he pushes east, he pushes north to consolidate and to uh, secure the borders of Israel against these three these three hostile nations. Um, some commentators have wondered about his fighting against Moab. If you remember, David's great grandmother was Ruth, who herself was a Moabitess. She was from Moab. So why is he attacking against these family members? Comes the question. And the sort of the Jewish secular history tells us um, that David, when he was on the run from Saul, had left his mother and father and other family members in Moab for sort of safekeeping to keep them out of the hands of Saul. And there is some understanding among these secular historians that the Moabites either abused David's family or even put them to death, which of course would have made David fairly angry, because we do not really read anything more about them after they go into Moab. And so there is this sense that something very bad happened to his extended family, David's extended family in Moab, and for that reason David became hostile to the Moabites, and that's why they became one of his target enemies. um, we see that he takes Gath from the Philistines. Gath was one of the major cities of the Philistines. Um, if we look over at the parallel passage over in 2 Samuel 8, for example, chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "Now after this it came about that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took control." This is the American Standard Version, says control of the chief city from the hand of the Philistines. Uh, the literal translation of that phrase, interestingly enough, the literal translation of that phrase is he took the bridle of the chief city, or the mother city. I'm sorry, the bridle of the mother city. And so here is if you will, the capital city of the Philistines was Gath, their mother city, and he's taken hold of the bridle of it. He's got the control. Of course, we know what the bridle does for a horse. You control that animal with the use of the bridle, and now David's got control. David even is putting garrisons in there in these cities, so that the Philistines are now completely subdued. Um, uh, he goes on, of course, to fight against the rest. He continues on in verse 9 of 1 Chronicles 18. "Now when king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, he had Hadaram his son. He sent Hadaram his son to King David to greet him and to bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and had defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with two. And Hadoram brought all kinds of articles of gold and silver and bronze. King David also dedicated these to the Lord with the silver and the gold which he had carried away from all the nations, from Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, the Philistines, and from Amalek. Moreover, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, defeated 18,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom, and all the Edomites became servants of David, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and righteousness for his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over his army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Aluid, was the recorder, and Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Abimelech, the sons of Abiathar, were priests, and Shavshah was the secretary. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and the sons of David were chiefs at the king's side. So here is the organization of David's army. Here's his success. We see him feeding these various armies, even the Edomites. Everywhere he goes among these nations, he's putting in garrisons. Why do you put in a garrison in these foreign nations? Huh? Control. That's right. You're going to not only are they broken down from attacking you in the from where they have been attacking you, but now you're going to be keeping a close watch on them. And if there is signs that they're going to try and attack again, the garrisons are right there to quickly put down any of that sort of nonsense. And so now these nations are paying tribute to David. We understand, in the days of Solomon, of course, there was enormous wealth that poured into Israel, but all of this began under David. You see that all of this began under David. It was under David that this wealth began to come into the nation. He's captured all of these nations. The Philistines, the Moabites, the Amorites, the Edomites all have garrisons. They're all sending tributes for Hadadezer and his kingdom, which was apparently a fairly small kingdom, probably as best we can tell to the northeast of Israel, is utterly crushed. Just apparently that defeat is total. David sacks his cities. David takes his army. David takes his chariots. His army apparently becomes effectively slaves to David, and that kingdom is really no more after this point. And we understand why this other king, Tou, had sent presents to David. Why? Because you just took out an enemy of mine. Apparently, this fellow was yet further northeast toward the Mesopotamian area, and David's just eliminated an enemy, and obviously this fellow's very pleased about it. And again, receiving gifts. So all this flow of wealth that comes into Israel that we see in Solomon's time is repeated, or is initiated rather, in David's time. But we begin from this to understand why God has refused to allow David to build the temple. Again, David's mission was not building the temple. David's mission, from God's purpose, was to strengthen Israel, secure Israel, and administer it properly. And that's what we find David doing here at the tail end of this chapter. He's reigning, he's administering justice and righteousness, and we see how he has organized his military, he's organized his administration to effectively take care of the country. Okay? Any questions or comments on that chapter? We go on then into Chronicles 19. Now this material is found also in 2 Samuel, the 10th chapter. And here we have this event that unfolds. Again, we see here the growing strength of David. This is the emphasis here that Ezra has. It's the growing strength of David. And remember, this First Chronicles is something of a, well, if I could call it this, it's something of a patriotic document. It's meant to encourage and to remind the nation of Israel how they came to be, how they came to be established. And we know that Ezra, of course, has led these remnant of the Jews back out of Babylon, out of Persia, and he's brought them back to Israel, and they're trying to reestablish their nation, reestablish their religion, and we've talked about that before. But here's the task before Ezra, is to remind them of the glory days, if you will, the glory days of their nation. It would be this would have been some roughly 200 years before Ezra was writing. It would be like us, again, looking back on the founding of this country and remembering the deeds of George Washington and some of the great military men that were with him there. And and uh, recounting those stories as a way of kind of helping to build up a little patriotic fervor. Um, so here we have now in 19 yet another episode here in the life of David and how David deals with a situation here. It says, now it came about after this that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, died, and his son became king in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, because his father showed me kindness, because his father showed kindness to me. So David sent messengers to console him concerning his father, and David's servants came into the land of the sons of Ammon to Hanun to console him. Well, all right, we don't know exactly what kindness that Nahash gave to David. It's speculated by some of the Bible scholars that during David's days of being on the run from Saul, that Nahash may have sent provisions or other supplies to David to help support him, because Nahash would have been in conflict with Saul, and therefore saw David as a possible ally and helped to support him. And David remembers that kindness that this king had sent him, and decides to honor him by sending comforters to his son. Um, uh, Says in verse 3, though, but the princes of the sons of Ammon said to Hanun, do you think that David is honoring your father and that he has sent comforters to you? Have not the servants come to you to search and to overthrow and spy out the land? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved them and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. Then certain persons went and told David about the men, and he sent to meet them. For the men were greatly humiliated. And the king said, stay in Jericho until your beards grow, and then return. So these messengers sent to send condolences, but they are viewed as spies. David, of course, has been very successful in his military campaigns, and so these guys are naturally, well, maybe they are sort of paranoid, suspicious of David and David's men, and they're going, no, these guys are spies. And so they treat them badly. Shaving these men would have been a sign of essentially indicating them in slavery. Slaves were shaved, free men were not. And so by shaving these men, he makes them appear to be slaves. And of course, he cuts off their garments, exposing their private parts, and again, just an act of humiliation. It's just intended to completely humiliate these men and then send them on their way, send them down the road. It was a great insult to these men. We look at Isaiah 20, for example. Isaiah 20 and verses 1 through 4, it says, about that year, the commander came to Ashdod when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent to him, and he fought against Ashdod and captured it. At that time, the Lord spoke through Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saying, go and loosen the sackcloth from your hips and take your shoes from your feet. And he did so, going naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign of and token against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away the captives of Egypt, and the exiles of Cush, young and old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. So we understand this was a shameful thing to have done to these men, and why? Well, these fellows again are paranoid, suspicious. These fellows were sort of related to, the Ammonites are sort of related to the Moabites, or at least had treaties with them. And so David's fights against the Moabites probably alarmed them greatly. And so they insult these messengers from David. And so David, effectively, this is a declaration of war. This is very effectively a declaration of war, that we're done with you. uh, it goes on and from there. And again, this is exactly paralleled in 2 Samuel, the 10th chapter. It's really almost very the very same material exactly, but we see what happens here. Um, Verse 6, when the sons of Ammon saw that they had made themselves odious to David, Hanun and the sons of Ammon sent 1,000 talents of silver to hire themselves chariots and horsemen from Mesopotamia and Aram Makkah and from Zobah, and they hired for themselves 32,000 chariots, and the king of Makkah and the people who came and camped before Medeba, and the sons of Ammon gathered together from their cities and came to battle. When David heard of it, he sent Joab and the army, the mighty men. The sons of Ammon came out and drew up the battle array at the entrance of the city, and the kings who had come were by themselves in the field. So Ammon hires from some of the other nations around them, the king of Makkah and others, Mesopotamia, and from Zobah, sending out this amount of 1,000 talents of silver. Now, it was estimated this amount, it was several years ago, this was estimated to be roughly about $1.5 million worth of money in more modern terms. If we were to put it even in today's dollars, it would be probably closer to $3 to $5 million of money that was sent by this king to try and hire these mercenaries. We see that he hires this great number of mercenaries. And of course, Joab is there as commander, as the field commander. Verse 10, now when Joab saw that the battle was against him, in front and in the rear, he selected from the choice men of Israel, and they arrayed themselves against the Arameans. But the remainder of the people he placed in the hand of Abishai, his brother, and they arrayed themselves against the sons of Ammon. So they have sort of a two-front battle going on here. They've got the Arameans in one front, and they got the Ammonites in another front. And so Joab comes up with a strategy. He said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will help you. Be strong and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what is good in his sight. So again, we see this. Again, look the language that's used here is this patriotic. It's this patriotic fervor. Sort of like reading about George Washington praying before a battle or something like that. Here we see Joab, organizing his armies and setting up his forces, and then offering this. It's not exactly a prayer, but at least a statement of faith toward God before the battle. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to the battle against the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the sons of Ammon saw that the Arameans fled, they also fled before Abishai his brother and entered the city. Then Joab came to Jerusalem. So Joab's strong attack against the Arameans drives them from the field. They're just hired mercenaries. They have no interest in dying for the glory of Ammon. They're just basically hired mercenaries. And as soon as they're hit and hit hard, they run away. The Ammonites, seeing that the Arameans are gone, now they scurry back into their city, a walled city, and now Joab sets up for a siege. It says here Joab goes back to Jerusalem. This battle, the scholars tell us, would have taken place roughly in the winter months of the year, and they don't get back to the battle for over a year later. It's actually over a year later before they kind of get back into the battlefield. Verse 16. When the Arameans saw they had been defeated by Israel, they sent messengers and brought out the Arameans who were beyond the river, with Shopach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, leading them. When it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came upon them and drew up in formation against them. And when David drew up in battle array against the Arameans, they fought against him. The Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed of the Arameans 7,000 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers, and put to death Shopach, the commander of the army. And when the servants of Hadadezer saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with David and served him. Thus the Arameans were not willing to help the sons of Ammon anymore. And so David then, he's got the Ammonites bottled up in their city, so they're not going to go anywhere. He uses the rest of his army to chase the Arameans. The Arameans try to fight against him because they've got to try and recover some degree of their kind of lost honor to recover themselves as mercenaries. Nobody wants to hire a mercenary that runs away at the first battle, so they try to come back and have a big fight with David. They get beat again, and again David kills off a whole bunch of the Arameans, kills the commander of their army, and the Arameans decide we've had enough, and you Ammonites, you're on your own, and they don't come to fight anymore. All right, questions on that? So we move into chapter 20. Now this is where it kind of gets interesting between the account here in First Chronicles and the account that we have over in Samuel. It says, now then it happened in the spring, at the time when the kings go to battle, that Joab led out the army and ravaged the land of the sons of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. And Joab struck Rabbah and overthrew it. A little bit of background. Some of the accounts, especially in Samuel, will tell you that in earlier battles, David had put himself sort of in danger. David had put himself sort of in kind of the forefront of the fighting and had been nearly injured or killed by some of the fighting with the Philistines. I believe it was with the Philistines. And David's men said, you can't do that. We're not going to let you do that anymore. The nation needs you. We don't need a dead king. We need a live king. And the nation needs you. And so they told him, you don't go fighting anymore. So David, on this time, stays in Jerusalem. Of course, we know from the account in 2 Samuel 11 where this parallels to a fair degree. 2 Samuel 11, this is where David is there in Jerusalem while the army is in the field. This is, again, about a year and a quarter later than the previous battles. So Joab is going out with his army. He's going to now attack the Ammonite city, and David is still in Jerusalem. We know, of course, from reading over in 2 Samuel 11, what happens next. What happens next is that David happens to see Bathsheba bathing. He has a desire for her. He ends up taking her. He ends up impregnating her. He ends up then calling it her husband back. And when her husband doesn't have relations with her, he sends Uriah, her husband, off to the battle lines to be killed. And so Uriah is killed, and David ends up taking Bathsheba for wife. And of course, this was abominable in the sight of God. And of course, God sends Nathan. We understand God sends Nathan then into David to accuse him. And David accepts that accusation and repents. But the damage is done, if you will. The damage is done. Interestingly enough, Ezra doesn't go into all that detail. There's all that detail that comes out, all the consequence that comes out of that. We will completely, if we'll look at Chronicles, we'll completely skip over David's sin with Bathsheba. We'll completely miss the episode of David's oldest son and Tamar, his sister, and the rape and murder that resulted in. We'll completely miss over Absalom and his rebellion against his father, and how he chases David out of the city and then is ultimately defeated. So all of that gets omitted, if you will, by Ezra. And why? We may ask why. Why are we going to exclude that history when Ezra has been very meticulous about copying, if you will, copying the account from 2 Samuel? Why is he omitting this storyline in this writing in First Chronicles? And the answer is, again, what's the purpose of the book? The purpose of the book is the encouragement of Israel as a nation, the encouragement of Israel as a religious organization as well. And this rather sordid story of David is really contrary to that purpose. And so the Holy Spirit, as in inspiring Ezra, has apparently given him permission to exclude those episodes, since they are already chronicled, they are already written about, they are already recorded in the book of 2 Samuel. Don't need to go over them again, because right now the storyline is focused on the successes of Israel. And so we see here in in chapter 20, verse 2, then David took the crown of the king from his head, and he found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there was a precious stone in it, and it was placed on David's head, and he brought out the spoil of that city, a very great amount. Again, we remember the storyline that Joab is about to, Joab has captured the city as far as as he says, the water, the water supply of the city. And so now the city can only last for about 3 days, no more than 3 days, because we have the water. We have all their water supplies, so they're going to have to surrender to us. And I don't want to capture the city because it'll be named after me. The king should capture the city. So David goes to take the city. Well, you notice here that verse 2 is in 2 Samuel 12. So there's from 2 Samuel 11 to 2 Samuel 12, kind of a big gap there. And that big gap, of course, is about Bathsheba and all that episode. And so you see how Ezra has been apparently given permission by the Holy Spirit to kind of go through and kind of pick out what he considers to be the important points, and ignoring some of the other episodes that are going, the other events that occurred. He brought, pardon? Yeah, it was a big crowd. That was a talent of gold. Would have weighed roughly 100 pounds, we're told. And it would have, the king would have not worn it on his head. He would have just about broken his neck to do that. But it would have, again, the scholars tell us that this crown was likely put on the statue, the idol that they had to Moloch, who was their god. And so this great crown was on Moloch, which the king had, sort of by connection to Moloch, their god, and would have been used only for like ceremonial occasions, but wouldn't have been something he wore. So David took it. Says he brought out the people who were in it and cut them with saws and sharp instruments and with axes. And thus David did all the cities of the sons of Ammon. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. Now this, he cut the people with saws and sharp instruments and axes. We probably would understand he did not put them to death necessarily. Some of them he did probably kill, but others would have been, they would have been maimed. He would have maybe cut off an arm or a hand or a foot, because you're not going to go to war against me anymore. And, if you're missing your right hand, then I'm pretty well assured that I don't have to worry about fighting you. Or if you're missing a foot, I don't have to worry about you coming running into my country to fight me. And so that is likely the meaning of this event. And it sounds pretty cruel. It sounds pretty barbaric to our ears. But this was sort of standard operating procedure for a lot of the nations in this day. That if you captured an enemy, if you remember an earlier account, um, the folks that are David is fighting against here, these Ammonites, these are the same folks that were in control of the Gilead area, the Gilead region of Israel during the days of King Saul, and or at the initial of King Saul's kingdom. And one of their key cities was Jabesh Gilead. Do you remember what the Ammonites came to Jabesh Gilead and said they were going to do? Remember that account? They came to Jabesh Gilead and said, we want every male to come out here and we're going to gouge out his right eye. If you remember that story. And the men of Jabesh Gilead said, give us a little bit of time, and if we can't find anybody who will save us, we'll come out to you. And Saul, when he heard about it, one of the early leadership positions of Saul, he brought the army together and took them up there and defeated the Ammonites and saved the city of Jabesh Gilead from having one of their eyes gouged out. So again, this was this idea of mutilating one's foes, one's potential enemies, was again standard operating procedure for the nations of this time. Okay. And then finally, the final, this is a short chapter, only 8 verses, but the final 5 verses here talk about then more about David. Again, we're hearing stories here. We're getting stories of David and his mighty men. And we should look at this as if we are reading a patriotic text on the beginnings of this country, George Washington and his generals. And we would read about the exploits of George Washington and how he won battles. And here's General Light Horse Harry, or here's what's the fellow that won the battle at the Cowpens? Can't think of his name. You're the history major. I'm an engineering major. I don't know. I know, but it's the same idea. You would be reading about the exploits of of George Washington and all of his great all of his great military men, and the successes that they had. And so we have the same sort of thing here in this text, verse 4. It came about after this that war broke out at Gezer with the Philistines. Then Shabbakai, the Hushathite, killed Shaphiah, one of the descendants of the giants, and they were subdued. And there was war with the Philistines again, and Ethanan, the son of Jair, killed Lamai, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, with the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Then there was another war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 fingers on each hand, and 6 toes on each foot. And he also was descended from the giants. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. These were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hands of David and by the hands of his servants. We should probably realize that this account is sort of an expansion on what was back in verse 18 and verse 1. This is not new battles. These are not new battles. These are just details of the fighting with the Philistines that was described in 18 and verse 1. But here we find out that, there's not just one giant, but apparently a whole family of them living there in or around Gath. And Goliath, of course, is the most famous of them. But there were several others that were of that same family, who apparently were of enormous stature and build. And so here was, here was Goliath, of course, was like 9 feet, over 9 feet tall, and was a huge fellow. And folks are saying, well, how can that be? Well, even in our own time, we've had men like, if you remember, the actor wrestler named Andre the Giant, who stood some, I think, almost 9 feet tall, and weighed in at about 500 pounds, if I remember right, and was a huge man. I mean, just a huge man. Well, imagine a whole family like that. Imagine a whole family of guys like that who, have this enormous build, enormous, Daniel Morgan. Yes, there we are. Yeah, Daniel Morgan, the victor at the Battle of the Cowpens. And very good. We can think of some of the other Revolutionary War generals that were successful. The only ones I can think of are the ones that were losers, like Gates or Benedict Arnold. Well, he actually did. Yeah, he was actually pretty good for a while. He actually won up in New Hampshire. Huh? I'm having fun. Oh, well, yeah, I was going to say, like, you never launch off on tangents. Yeah, like you never launch off on tangents. Yeah, I know. I've been in your classes. As we go wandering afield. At least it ties to the topic somewhat. Again, of the purpose of this document. The purpose, again, is to bring Israel together, to remind them, hey, let's remember our glory days. Let's remember when we were a mighty nation. We were feared. We were feared by these nations, and let's keep that in mind. All right, I'm not gonna go into chapter 21. I'll go into there next week. Any questions or comments on any of this? Any other thoughts or ideas? Again, the purpose here, and we're going to see that the real purpose again is to remind them of the role of their nation in history, the role of their nation toward God. We're going to see, as we have seen, if you look at some of the language that's used here, chapter 18, we go back to chapter 18 and notice, like, for example, verse 12, the Lord helped David wherever he went. And he says that he says it in verse 13. He says it again in verse 6. Each time he's emphasizing it's the Lord. This isn't just David. It isn't just Israel. It's the Lord. It's God. God is going to be for us. God is on our side, and we can reestablish that relationship with God, and we can have that good times again. But it requires that we be obedient to the will of God, and that, I think, is what is certainly implied in this text. All right, thank you for your attention. We'll continue on to chapter 21 next time.